Welcome, everybody. My name is Rebecca. I'm a career advisor in the Malone Center for Career Engagement, and I was working with Dr. Liao in the biology department to put on this wonderful panel on genetic counseling as a focus for this semester and helping you learn more about the profession and hear from Furman grads, get their advice and insight. So I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then maybe Dr. Liao, if you want to kick it off with the first question, we'll go from there.
Well, I'll kick us off. Hi, my name is JaLisa Decker, and I am currently a genetic counselor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. I graduated from Furman in 2019 as a proud biology major, and I did my genetic counseling training up at the Johns Hopkins NIH training program and just started here in Nashville back in March. You can go ahead and go, Alyson.
I'm Alyson Krokosky. I'm a 2007 graduate of Furman, a proud biology major, as we all are. And I did my graduate training at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I have moved around several times since I completed my graduate training, but have primarily worked in northeastern Wisconsin, which is where I'm originally from, as well as the Washington, D.C. metro area. And in a little bit, I'd be happy to tell you kind of more about the different positions I've held since graduation.
Hey everybody, my name is Alicia Gomes. I graduated from Furman in 2006, so I think I'm old, but I went to the USC South Carolina Columbia Genetic Counseling Program, and since 2010 I've been working at UAB in various roles to include pediatrics, a laboratory genetic counselor, and now I am assistant professor for the genetic counseling program here at UAB. So I can tell you more about those roles too as we go.
All right, thank you, all of you. We are so proud of you. And it's raining and it's really windy here, so I'm pretty sure that you guys are not back on campus. So let me start with the very first questions that we have in mind, and we want three of you to share some of the insight and knowledge with us. Okay, so could you please briefly explain what you do now and what a day in your life looks like? A weekday, not weekend. So what does your weekday look like? JaLisa, why don't you start?
Sure, yeah. So a day in my life, I kind of, in my head, think of it as I have three different types of days that I may have in any given week. So one of those days might be when I'm in my own genetic counseling clinic. So I have patients who come to see me for genetic counseling, and I'm in a peds and adult setting. So that could range anywhere from a baby who's just a couple weeks old and we saw when they were in the NICU and they have a new genetic diagnosis, and I'm talking to the family about that. And that can range all the way from children and adults who maybe have a known genetic condition in the family, and we're talking about potentially testing them, and a large variety of things in between there. Another one of my days looks more like working in clinic with our geneticists, our MDs, and our nurse practitioners as they're seeing patients, and I'm providing genetic counseling support as we think about creating testing plans and helping figure out the best next step for those families. And then the other type of day that I often have is full of preparing for those other days and calling out results and talking to families to figure out kind of next steps for them. So that's kind of a broad overview of what my day might look like from week to week.
I can go ahead and go. So my day has moved a lot from seeing patients. So I used to see patients primarily, but as a laboratory genetic counselor, my role has primarily looked like going into the lab, and we always called it like a firefighter. So there was always a fire to be put out. And so it was just kind of my job to be on the spot and ready to do and come up with a creative approach to try to fix what's going on. So I would get phone calls from genetic counselors who had patients that they were concerned about and would like to know what was the best testing approach, for example. And so we would critically think about what the potential diagnoses could be. We would think about alternative testing approaches that were a lot of times outside of the normal testing approaches that you would think of. And then I would work with the lab to make sure that they did what we wanted them to do. And then on the back end of that, if the lab had a problem, the sample failed, there was a lab error, the results are weird. So they would let me know, and then it was my responsibility to try to explain that to the providers. And then I would also get calls from patients, either because they were upset for a lot of different reasons, but a lot of times it really just came down to the psychosocial components of they were anxious about their testing and they hadn't told family what was going on, for example. And so they just, it could be a 6-day turnaround test, but it was too long. And so I spent a lot of time with them using my psychosocial skills from genetic counseling. And so now, working in the assistant professor world, I still get to spend time in the lab doing all of those things that we just talked about. But in addition to that, I am teaching lectures to genetic counseling students, first years and second years. But my role is specific because I have that niche of laboratory genetic counseling. I'm kind of their laboratory person. So anything that is related to genetic testing or laboratory medicine, I am their professor for that.
And currently I work in a community-based health system in northeastern Wisconsin. So much like JaLisa mentioned, having days where it's really kind of clinic heavy versus other days where it's more administrative type tasks, whether that's charting or working on insurance and letters of medical necessity, calling out results. But one of the things that I think differentiates the position that I'm in from the position that JaLisa is in is there is not a geneticist or a physician affiliated with our genetics department. So there are now 4 genetic counselors in the department that I work in Appleton, Wisconsin. And we really are the genetics experts for our health system. And so that kind of puts a little bit different spin on some of the things that we do. Much like Alicia was describing, we also do a lot of education of the providers that are part of our network and partner with a lot of the local providers then to provide the necessary follow-up care when we establish a diagnosis for a patient or a family. When I came into the position that I'm currently in, which was a little over 3 years ago now, it was really posted as an oncology genetic counselor position. We're based in a cancer clinic, and I came and applied for the job and said, I'm willing to help you with your oncology patient-related needs and patients with a family history of cancer, but I also have a lot of interest in seeing patients for other indications. And I would really like to expand the service line of what we can offer patients here locally, because really the next biggest kind of genetics hubs from where I am are kind of about 2 hours in a couple of different directions. And so now my patient caseload is about half oncology related, but half non-oncology related, where I can be seeing patients and facilitating testing without having a geneticist or a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant there to do an exam or things like that. So also seeing patients because of a personal or family history of a cardiac concern, a neurological concern, or patients who are pregnant or currently thinking about getting pregnant. So I've really diversified the type of patients that I see, which is something I really enjoy and would probably be a good point of discussion because different people take different approaches in their careers with how they structure the job that they do.
Thank you all for sharing that. And Alyson, I have to tell you, my husband is from Neenah. So I know exactly where Appleton is, and I've been there many, many times. So I can picture what you're talking about. So next question
You guys
for
talking
you.
about Neenah?
Okay. He has to say hello. He loves Wisconsin. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So next question. Tell us a little bit about how you decided to pursue genetic counseling as a career or other things you might have considered. And then what were some of the important factors in making your decision? And we can start maybe with JaLisa this time again.
Sure, yeah. So I kind of went into Furman and I knew I liked biology and I knew I was interested in science in general. And I had done some research actually in high school. And then I was one of the first students in Dr. Dubash's lab when that had started. And so I really loved research and I loved asking questions and learning new things. And I saw that in my future. And so for a minute, I thought perhaps I'd be going this PhD research route because I loved that like process of curiosity. But then I realized, man, I really love working with people. And I think that needs to be a part of what I do in the future. And so I learned about genetic counseling. I honestly don't remember the exact first time I learned about genetic counseling, but I kind of, when I heard about it, I was like, wow, a lot of the things that people are interested in who do genetic counseling are things that I do, like these research experiences. And I was involved with Heller Service Corps, and I was independently doing, working with Crisis Line with Mental Health America, and had that experience with this crisis counseling. And so kind of these things in parallel, I was like, wow, these kind of really line up with this field that I've just learned about called genetic counseling. Maybe I should look more into that. And then I kind of really found that it was a great kind of combination of those academic interests as well as like psychosocial working with people interests.
I'll go next. My story is a little bit different in that I actually came to Furman knowing that I was interested in genetic counseling. And one of the reasons that I actually selected to go to Furman from Wisconsin, so I'm in Appleton practicing now, but that is also where I'm from, is because when I came to do my campus visit at Furman, I was talking with my admissions counselor about my interest in genetics and genetic counseling, and he knew that Furman had a good working relationship with the Greenwood Genetics Center, and perhaps I would be able to do an internship. And so that's how I ended up 1,000 miles away from home. But when I got to Furman on my freshman hall, I was talking with one of the other girls who lived on my hall, whose name was also Allison. And we both said, what do you think you want to study? We want to study biology. What do you think you want to do with your biology degree? Well, I want to be a genetic counselor. And we both said, no, you don't, because that's what I want to do. And nobody else knows what this job is. So we were very fortunate to kind of personalize our biology experience while we were at Furman. And part of the reason that I'm thankful that I knew I was interested in it early was I was able to take advantage of some internships. So I did not go the research route in the wet lab. I actually did not end up doing an internship at Greenwood, even though that was one of my main draws to Furman. But I did an internship at a health advocacy nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and kind of took my experience from there. But I found out about genetic counseling actually while I was in high school, and kind of did a lot of opportunities and exposures to kind of cement that was what I was interested in. And all these years later, I'm still doing it.
I think I'm the exact opposite of that. I had no clue what genetic counseling was. I didn't even know it existed until almost, I think it was my senior year. And the only reason that I even knew what it was is because Dr. Liao one day said, you should be a genetic counselor. And I was like, okay, but I don't know what they do. And she arranged an opportunity for me to meet with the genetic counselor. But before that, when I got to Furman, I was, and since I was little, I was dead set on saying that I wanted to be a doctor. And then I changed it to a doctor or a scientist. And then I took organic chemistry. And then I said, maybe not a doctor, but perhaps PA at that point. And so then there was a professor there at the time named Dr. Larson. And so I got to work in her lab extracting DNA. And I really fell in love with genetics at Furman. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of delve and explore and see what other people were doing for science projects. And I really did like research. And so when Dr. Liao told me about genetic counseling and I really started to look at it, I felt like I was too far into my undergrad degree to say, I'm just going to start focusing on genetic counseling. So I ended up, through Dr. Liao, learned about the Greenwood Genetics Center as well. So I ended up working as a laboratory technologist in the molecular lab. And I did that for about 2 years. But it was a great opportunity and great exposure because at Greenwood Genetics Center, they have genetic counselors that are doing all kinds of things. So working in the lab, I was working directly with their lab GC, and they allowed me the opportunity to shadow so many of the clinical genetic counselors there. So I got an opportunity to really see all of the different types of genetic counselors. I also realized that I really cannot have a job where I can't talk to people because I was talking to the samples. And so all of that together just solidified for me that I needed to go to genetic counseling. And so that's how I got there from there.
That is wonderful. Actually, I work with all three of you, either in the classroom or in the lab or in a hallway. So it's great. So now I'm wondering about your undergraduate experience, not just the knowledge that you learned in classes, but how has this experience informed or influenced you throughout your career? What part of your undergrad experience kind of shape you or guide you throughout your career? I think, Alyson, you have the longest career. So in what way that your undergrad experience kind of help you?
You also give me the hardest question to start with, Dr. Liao.
Because I trust you.
I think it is a combination of things. I think, of course, it's the courses, right, that kind of set the foundation. And my advisor from Furman could tell you how I went into his office as a sophomore and was like, here are all the prerequisites that I need to take for the 30 genetic counseling programs in the country. How are we going to make this work so that when I'm ready to graduate, like I can prepare to apply right away for graduate school? But I think one of the other things that I came away from Furman with is an appreciation, much like Alicia was mentioning and JaLisa was mentioning, that curiosity, right? I think that really was something that was encouraged when I was studying at Furman. And I think through relationships with the professors that I had and some of my classmates to really begin to make those connections. We were just talking before the webinar started that I forward all sorts of random information still to Dr. Liao that I think will be helpful, because I feel this tie, right, of wanting to pay it forward to the other Furman students that are going to come after me, because I realized that it was some of those initial ties that I started to form at Furman that are still people and individuals that I talked to as part of my career 15 years out of my time at Furman. Alicia was a year ahead of me in school. We see each other at the national meeting and we always catch up. She's one of the genetic counselors that I've actually known for the longest period of time. And so having the opportunity at Furman to begin to form those kind of very personal relationships with peers, but also with some of your professors, I think is something that I still see kind of the thread through my career this far removed from Furman.
Thank you. Alicia, yes.
Yeah, so I would say there were a lot of small tidbits that I didn't necessarily appreciate at the time that really did prepare me for genetic counseling through Furman. Some of the things that I can think of is the smaller class sizes, for one, because most of the genetic counseling programs, it's only maybe 8 to 10 at best. Maybe 15 people in, as a cohort that is going through. And I feel like that's a different feel and a different, dynamic than if someone has come from a school where they were one of 100, people in a classroom, because there's a lot more intimacy to the class. They know when you're not learning something, when you're in, grad school in such a small class size. And there's a lot of investment into your education. And I felt like I got that from Furman. So that was something that I felt way more comfortable coming to my professors when I did not understand something, for example. There were a lot of opportunities. I am one of those people that if there's something to get involved in, I am involved. And I did that quite a bit at Furman. And so it gave me the ability to multitask, which is something that I use routinely, but also just having the opportunity to have so many leadership opportunities was great. One, because it did make me a very competitive applicant for a genetic counseling school, because leadership is one of the things that they like to see and that you have vested interest and involvement in things. But also, just having that leader ability and decision-making ability helps you as a genetic counselor, because you have to make some choices and some thoughts and triage, different disorders and just having some decisiveness about yourself is an important component as well. So those are kind of like the small things that I didn't appreciate at the time, that I can now look back and say, you know, there was a lot of small pieces of Furman, but the genetics class I thought was very helpful for me as well, that I took, because not only did they do the hard science, but we talked about the ethics at the time. And that was what truly drew me into how genetics and psychology, or just genetics and healthcare, can really intertwine, because it's not just the hard science, it's how it applies to people, and every person is different, so you can't apply it the same way. And so I really took that out of that genetics class that I took at Furman, and I really appreciated that.
Those are such great answers. And I think probably, you know, with more career experience than me, it's really exciting for me to hear like what you guys have kind of taken from this. I think the only tidbit that I want to add that's just notable to me and is a little tangential is one of the things I was also like that in undergrad, saying yes to so many things and taking on opportunities. And that is obviously can be very valuable. But I think I've also learned through undergrad and through grad school that also you have to learn to say no sometimes and take care of yourself. And one of the most important things that I remember from Furman now is with Dr. Liao's microbiology class, we would actually do mindfulness before class and tests. And when at the end of college, things kept getting a little more stressful, and in grad school, I had more test anxiety than I'd ever been used to before, I pulled back on that and like have started using that mindfulness then, like that I learned back then, that I still use now, because like Alicia said, these can be stressful situations. And, you know, when we're talking about genetic disease and conditions and people's health and their families, those can be really hard cases. And so like learning to take care of yourself so that you can actually do your job is, I think, such an important part of being a genetic counselor. And that's something that I started learning in undergrad. And I think I'm still obviously going to be learning for many years to come.
Yeah, I think self-care is a lifelong skill and practice. So next question, and you kind of alluded to some of these things, but as you think about your roles, or even, you know, previous roles that you've had, the characteristics or skills or abilities that have been essential for you to do your job and do your job well. And maybe even for Alicia, if I could ask you to kick it off and talk about some of the skills or characteristics that you look for in applicants too for genetic counseling programs.
Yeah, happily. One is multitasking. And I think about it from a career perspective and as a student perspective, because you will be taking more than one class at a time. You may be taking classes and seeing, you know, doing clinical rotations and doing your thesis project all simultaneously, and you have to do well at all of them. And so having characteristics as a multitasker, I think is very important. And then even on the job, because as I think we all have shared, there's the main hat that we wear, but then we're all taking on other responsibilities and roles as well. And so just being able to sufficiently balance that without jeopardizing healthcare is an important piece. So having that multitasking ability is one. The other thing that I think of is excellent communication. But to me, excellent communication is not just verbally. A written communicator is important. And then there's sometimes the nonverbal things that people don't appreciate, especially when you've had class online for a while. But you know, just being able to look people in the eye and not moving around during interviews, for example, these are important things, because if you're giving people some of the hardest information that they're going to have to understand that impacts the rest of their lives, we have to make sure that you're someone who can sit focused in a way and deliver that information in, you know, a calm and easy way that people can appreciate. So those are some of the things that I can think of off the top of my head, especially when we're interviewing genetic counseling students or applicants. That is sometimes it's the little things that you can get dinged for that you didn't appreciate. Like you're in a swivel chair and I can't keep up with the conversation because you're moving too much, you know. But then we think about that and how that could potentially translate to you sitting on a stool in front of a patient. And so we already have to teach you so much. We hope that you would come in with some of these things already in place. So just think about it from that perspective as well.
I would second both of those and add to them. So I would add to being a good multitasker to also being able to prioritize, right? So as Alicia and JaLisa were talking about, they said yes to a lot of things at Furman. Even if you are a good multitasker, things are going to vary even over the course of the day in terms of what is your priority. And so being able to do that and being able to continually reprioritize and not just have your to-do list, but to be able to say, okay, this is now the most important thing. The other thing that I will add, I think we could give lots of attributes, right? But is that you have to be someone who has that curiosity or that desire for lifelong learning. You can't go into the field of genetic counseling and think, okay, I did my undergraduate and I did my graduate school training, like I'm gonna coast from here until I retire, right? Because if I was still counseling patients based on the information and technology that I learned about while I was in graduate school, I would be giving people perhaps very outdated information, because the field of genetics is evolving so quickly that I really think of graduate school as really giving you the building blocks and the resources to be able to continue to do your job. But then it's really on you to be able to continue to do the learning so that you are giving your patients the most up-to-date information. So if you feel like by the time you get done through Furman, you're like, I'm good learning new information for a while, then maybe this isn't the field for you. But if you get really excited by it, then I think I learn new things all the day, every day, and I find that very exciting.
Yeah, those are all such great answers. And I think the only thing I would add to that really goes along with the communication is being a really good listener and being able to be an empathetic listener, as that is so important for your interactions with your colleagues and the people you're working with, but with patients. And when you're having those more psychosocial discussions about things in like a genetic counseling session, being able to like truly listen and like try to understand somebody and not passively listening to them is a really key skill there too.
These are all great insights. So now I will have to ask you guys to kind of step back a little bit and think about what advice that you have for students who are considering a genetic counseling as their career post-graduation. So all these are what you talked about are great, but can you kind of give them a more concrete advice that what can they do now to get themselves ready for it? Or what you wish you would have, what you wish you knew, that works too. So, but what kind of advice for students right now, or your 22-year-old you? So Alicia, yes.
Yeah, I can start. So I would say one important thing is, there's so many people who apply and it's very competitive to get into genetic counseling programs. So one very important piece is making sure that you truly understand what genetic counseling is. We only have 8 spots, so we have to make sure that, for example, here, that if we're going to give this 8 spots to one of the, 40, 50 people who have, sorry, y'all, my kids, who have applied, we want to make sure that this person truly understands what genetic counseling is. So opportunities and exposures that you have to the field are important. But sometimes, people only think about shadowing. Shadowing is very important, but so is phone interviews with genetic counselors. And that's something you can put on your CV, for example, that is appreciated when genetic counseling programs are evaluating you. They want to see how many different types of genetic counselors have you talked to? How much exposure have you had with the field through the literature or through podcasts even? All of that matters. It is all opportunities and ways for you to kind of get involved with genetics before you're a genetic counselor. If you have the opportunity to do any type of research or be a part of a research project or study that's happening at Furman, that's also a great opportunity and something that you could put on your CV that could matter quite a bit. And the other thing that I can think of, I don't want to say everything that I can think of to give everybody else some time too, but like opportunities to be exposed to patient populations. So it doesn't have to be that you are a genetic counseling assistant, for example. Just working in a doctor's office, you know, being a babysitter for a support group where that you're helping to watch all the kids with a certain disorder while the families meet, or any opportunities that you can have where you can be exposed to these patient populations that may be seen are always valuable.
That's such a great comprehensive overview. And I think those opportunities to learn about genetic counseling and be exposed to it. Another one of the things that popped into my mind is kind of, there's this exposure to genetic counseling and research things that are important. And also there's exposure to population. Some other ideas for that is in addition to doing crisis counseling, which was helpful in just me learning about myself and so many valuable skills there, but also then applicable to genetic counseling school, was also working at a camp for kids with differences in abilities. And that was a great way to get to like know families and things better.
I think the only thing I will add is just kind of what I alluded to before. I think networking is incredibly important. And you've got 3 of us here. We know there are other Furman graduates who have gone on to be genetic counselors. Not everybody comes through the biology department, right? So certainly we were talking about one that many of us know who was a chemistry major. There are several who have actually come through the psychology department at Furman. There were 2 program directors at one point that were both Furman graduates, but had come through the psychology department. And so establishing these relationships, but then working to maintain them, because then you have different people you can pull on for different reasons. So with Alicia's hat in the lab at UAB, periodically I have a case and I know I'm going to have a helpful, friendly voice on the other end of the phone where we can catch up about life, and then I can ask my really tough question and I can become the fire that she needs to put out at that point. But I think that's one of the things that also makes this field unique, is that it's a growing field, but it's not huge yet. I think it's going to continue to grow, but I've got people that I know who do different things and utilize that resource, right? Because I think one of the other skills and revelations you will have is you don't know everything there is to know as a genetic counselor, but you know who you know or where to go to get that answer. And so having that network is really, really helpful.
That's such a good point, Alyson. You know, we always joke, but we're also kind of serious. One of the things that we say with the program is that when you graduate, you're just minimally qualified to be a genetic counselor, you know? So it really does help to, you know, use your network and your resources to learn as much as you can. That's so true.
Awesome, thank you. So I sent a message in the chat and want to make sure we leave some time for students to submit questions that are on their minds. We have a first question. Does being a non-STEM major hurt your chances of getting into a genetic counseling program? Or what advice might you have for a non-STEM major?
I'll go first. So I haven't disclosed this yet in this group, but I will now. So much like Alicia has programmatic experience there, I am also involved with one of the training programs here in Wisconsin. And I would say it is not an automatic disqualifier for you. I think the biggest thing is to be aware of what the prerequisites are for the graduate programs, right? And work to determine how are you going to incorporate those, whether it would be in your time at Furman as an undergraduate, or maybe you find out about genetic counseling after you're well on your way to your major, and so you may not get all of the prerequisites done while you are at Furman. That's okay. You will have the opportunity to still complete them before you would put in an application for graduate school. And in some ways, I think being a non-STEM major can give you an advantage in the application process, depending on what other ancillary activities you've involved yourself in or have had exposure to, because as we've talked about, admissions to graduate programs has gotten really, really competitive. And one of the things that you're going to want to do in your CV and your personal statement in your interview is talk about what makes you a unique candidate? Why should this program want to offer you one of their 8 spots as opposed to the 40 or 50 other applicants that they're interviewing? And so it actually can bring you a very unique perspective. When I think of my graduate cohort, about half of us had gone into graduate school straight from undergrad, and the other half had come in having done another job. One had worked in the lab, one was a teacher. And so it may give you a unique advantage and certainly a different perspective that I think is really important to the profession.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I mean, we've had a lot of education majors, psychology majors, biology, chemistry, I mean, you name it. We've had people, as long as you've gotten the prereqs, your actual major doesn't matter as long as you've kind of completed those prereqs.
Awesome. Okay, so we have another question from the audience. How long is graduate school for genetic counseling, and what does it entail?
So most genetic counseling programs are a 2-year master's degree. There are a couple of exceptions. The program I went to happens to be 2.5 years, and there's one program that's 18 months, a couple that are different. But most of them are 2 years. And I know these two work closely with programs, but kind of a broad overview. Most genetic counseling programs are going to have classes that have your basic didactic genetics knowledge and your counseling training. And then a large part of most genetic counseling or any genetic counseling program is going to be your clinical rotations. And so that might look different for every program. And often that may start with some observation of the different types of genetic counseling of cancer, prenatal, peds, laboratory, and so on and so forth. And then as your training goes on, students take on more of a role. So you're working with supervisors and learning the aspects of genetic counseling with close supervision, and then take on more and more roles by yourself until you're coming to the end of your training. And then you have more confidence in actually practicing as a genetic counselor. Most genetic counseling, any genetic counseling program as well, is going to have some sort of capstone or thesis project, and that can look quite different. Some will have more of a capstone project, and that may be working with an advocacy group, that may be developing materials, and that can range from a more research-focused study where you're going through IRB approval and doing, interviews or surveys with certain patient populations to develop a publishable manuscript. And so that can look different for every program, but there's going to be some aspect of all of those things in every genetic counseling program. I'll let you guys add anything else.
No, you're good. One thing that I can think of, and if you're looking at programs, one big difference that you can see is some programs, your first year, you are taking didactic classes the same time that you start your clinical rotations. And so it's kind of a half and half mixture. And that is how it is for the whole 2 years. And then some of them you front load all of your classes. So you take the majority of your didactic classes that first year, and then you do the majority of your clinical placements that second year. And so I wouldn't say that one scenario is better than the other per se. I think it comes down to personal preference and how you think you would work best, but it is one big difference that you'll see from one program to another. So if you feel like you would have a preference, like if you would rather be a person who takes all your classes first versus if you're somebody who'd like to get in there and see things at the same time that you're learning about it, then that might be something that you need to look at in deciding which program might be right for you.
That's a great point, Alicia. And I guess maybe now is just a good point too to play it forward, right? So after you go to graduate school, then what happens, right? And essentially, from a working perspective, once you have your master's degree, then you have to sit for our certification exam. So while there are differences in how training is done, they're all preparing you for the same end goal, which is to sit for our national certification exam. And then depending on the state that you work in, you may also have to apply for licensure. But one of the things that I always like to point out to students or prospective students is you don't have to go into graduate school knowing or thinking what kind of genetic counselor you want to be when you are done with training. you may in fact come out and do what you thought you were going to do, right? But you get the exposure in school to everything because everybody, at least currently, sits for the same national exam. And so that's a good opportunity to experiment with the different subspecialties in genetic counseling. We've also focused a lot on clinical and laboratory genetic counselors, but I will also put a plug in, especially since I've graduated, that the field of genetic counseling has really diversified. And there are many, many other types of opportunities to function as a genetic counselor. So because I'm a little crazy and I like to overcommit myself in some ways, in addition to working full-time for my current clinical job, I do some consulting work on the side for my initial full-time employer, which was that health advocacy nonprofit in Washington, D.C. So I do some educational material development for them and collaborate with a bunch of the disease-specific support organizations across the United States and sometimes even around the world. So there's opportunities in that space. There are opportunities in the public health space. So newborn screening, a state-based program, those often have genetic counselors involved in them at various points throughout that process. There's a whole industry sector of genetics. So the lab that Alicia works for is an academic institution affiliated lab, but there are commercial genetic testing laboratories that have genetic counselors as part of their staff. And they can do a whole host of roles, from writing the actual genetic test result reports that then go out to providers and clinical genetic counselors, to serving in more of a sales role. And so that's one of the things, that's one of the ways that I've seen the field really shift in the last 13 years since I've been practicing. And so I think that was just worth mentioning, even though we all have some commonality in the clinic or academic laboratory space, that there are many, many different types of roles that genetic counselors can fill.
Thank you. So I know you talked a little bit about licensing, Alyson. There's just another more specific question. Is licensing or your licensure transferable from state to state? How does that work? Okay.
Licensure is state-based, and so it does not transfer. There's talk about someday we will maybe get to that, but we're not there yet. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm going to say somewhere between 25 to 30 of the states in the US have licensure or licensure in the works. So for instance, Wisconsin passed our licensure legislation in May of this year, but now we have a year of doing the rule writing to get into place all of the nitty-gritty legal details, which poses a unique conundrum, because one of the types of roles that I didn't mention earlier for genetic counselors is telehealth. And so there are genetic counselors who, you know, maybe do genetic counseling by phone or by video visit. And if they are working with patients across state lines, they may have to have licensure in more than one state. And so while that is not all of us, that certainly applies to a good proportion of genetic counselors. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why there's interest in figuring out, is there a way that we can make our licensure more nationwide? But right now it is state-based.
Okay.
I will at least say I was just going to say, at least, you know, one good thing is that most jobs that you have will pay for your licensure. So even if you need licensure from multiple states, most jobs do pay for your licensure. They even pay for your certification too. So all of these different, you know, benchmarks that you have to meet as a genetic counselor, because the job is in such high demand, those are things that are a part of your, you know, contract or your negotiation for these jobs, is that they're willing to pay for these things.
Good information to have. So question again, and this is something I was going to ask anyway, some of the challenges that genetic counselors face, or even more personally, what do you find to be the most challenging aspect of your job, or like a least favorite part? I go from there.
I'll go first on this one. I'm going to put it into two buckets. So I'm going to give you my least favorite administrative type task that I have to do, and then think about it from more of a clinical perspective. So my least favorite is working with insurance companies for determining coverage of genetic testing. That's something that has changed a lot over the course of the 13 years that I've been practicing, but it still remains my number one least favorite thing. Actually, as part of my career, I did a 3.5-year stint at a military hospital in the Washington, D.C. area. And one of the best parts of that job, there were many good parts, but one of the best parts of the job is I didn't have to worry one bit about health insurance coverage or prior authorization. And it was a glorious 3.5 years of my life. I think personally, one of the challenging parts of my job is also one of the most rewarding parts of my job, which seems counterintuitive. But there are days where I give patients and families really, really difficult news, really difficult diagnoses, sometimes making a diagnosis of a condition that's going to progress and perhaps progress quite quickly, or put them at high risk for significant medical complications. And those can be really difficult days that can be really hard to be kind of the bearer of that news. But at the same time, some of those families and the interactions I've had with them are some of my most memorable. And so that goes back to kind of a couple things that we've talked about along the way, which is on those difficult days, it can be helpful to have your team to kind of process and lean on in those difficult days, because fortunately, we don't all have a difficult day generally at the same time. But then I think to what we were talking about earlier with self-care and mindfulness and things like that is also incredibly important. There are some days where I know I'm going to give a diagnosis and then I need 30 minutes away from my desk where I don't have to answer the phone. I don't need to be thinking about the next patient. I need to take that 30 minutes and just kind of process what that was like for me and what that was like for that family.
You can go ahead, JaLisa, if you want to.
I really was going to say, I completely agree with what you have to say, Alyson. It was really reflective of the thoughts going through my mind. So I'll let you go ahead, Alicia.
For me, I think I'm in a different place, since my role has, for the most part, been more industry related. I would say my biggest challenge is balancing what I find is kind of the integrity and the heart of what genetic counseling is when interacting with people who have heard about genetics, but genetics isn't necessarily their area of expertise. You hear a lot with personalized medicine, for example, that's a hot button thing. There's a lot of direct to consumer companies. There's a lot of precision medicine approaches that people want to take. And many times, the person who's kind of spearheading that doesn't necessarily appreciate that groundwork of what it means to work in genetics and things that we have to think about, like the psychosocial aspects and advocating for the patient to make sure that while it's cool and while we can find out about it, should we? And so I would say one of the challenges that I've had is making sure that I have a seat at the table for those decisions, but then also voicing my opinion when I find it's appropriate, because you don't want to be the person who's always negative, but at the same time, you don't want to be the yes person when you know, for example, that it's not the best idea for patients. So whether you're in the clinic, whether you're doing education, whether you're in industry, I found that one of the biggest pieces of genetic counseling is being advocates for patients, and patients who are going to have or at risk of having a genetic disorder, and kind of being the person that speaks up for them. And so even when I think the science is cool, I always have to take a step back and try to remind myself and think about, well, what does that mean for patients? How would that affect patient care? And kind of take that approach from it. So that's the biggest challenge for me.
Absolutely. This is very insightful. Thank you all. There's one more question from the audience. We'll kind of see where this takes us time-wise. As maybe we'll start with JaLisa, because this maybe is a little bit more recent for you, but in terms of interviewing for genetic counseling programs, kind of what that process is like, and all of you can chime in on this, what that process is like, how to prepare to the best of your ability, and ways to stand out as an applicant.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of very general advice about interviewing that applies to any field, as being prepared, like the way you dress, the way you prepare yourself, getting in the right mindset. I think one of the most valuable things for me in preparing for genetic counseling interviews was kind of like we talked about, is the importance of knowing what genetic counseling is, but also being able to communicate that, because one of the important parts of being a genetic counselor is communication. And so being able to answer questions and really practicing out loud, talking with yourself, and whether it be your parents, your friend, your roommate, and practicing talking about genetic counseling and why you're excited, and really like letting those words flow, I think was really helpful for me in like getting that experience. One of the things that I found most helpful through interviews too was a lot of questions really come back to your experience of what is a time that you have experienced a hardship, or where you've had to face X, Y, and Z. And so I found it always very helpful to think about the things that you've done and remember, oh, that time that I worked at this camp, volunteered at this, did this research experience. And I had a list of all of those things. And before every interview day, really just kind of thought about like, what did I learn from each of those things? So that when I was trying to think of examples of whatever situation they threw at me, I knew where to pull those from. And that was a really helpful thing going through interview season for me.
I know for us, and Alyson, I don't know if it's the same for your program too, but post-COVID, one thing that stuck was the ability to do interviews virtually. And so we only do virtual interviews here at UAB now. And a lot of that is, in the past, when it was in person, you did have to fly or travel, or however you had to get to all the different places that you wanted to interview. But now there's so many that are offering virtual interviews, but there's the good that you have the ability to, interview with more places because you don't have to spend the money to travel. But there is the con of it that some people who would interview well in person maybe don't interview as well virtually. So to JaLisa's point, I think it's important to interview with some people as practice interviews virtually ahead of time, and, do it with someone who will give you honest feedback. Like, you are never looking at the camera, or, it can be small things. You look very stiff because all we see is a very small square of you. And we have to get as much information from that small square as possible. So to JaLisa's point as well, I completely agree that anything outside of just whatever exposure you've had to genetic counseling, but I'm sure you've done so many things that you can tie back. Like, what is your greatest accomplishments? It doesn't have to be something genetic related. If you really enjoyed an experience or a rewarding experience you had in service or with a sorority or fraternity, any of that is valuable experiences. It gives us an opportunity to get to know you as a person. And it's always good to make sure that they can understand who you are as a person without going over the line of not being professional. So you might be fun and jokey. I'm one of those people, but there's a fine line between being jokey and being inappropriate and coming off as immature. So you just have to make sure that you can find that right line. And I think practice interviewing is a great way to do that.
I would agree with all of that. And to the point that Alicia made earlier too, right? Even with virtual interviews, all those small things. I did interviews last cycle where people were spinning all the time in their chair, and I wanted to just reach through the screen and still them, right? And a lot of that is nerves, and we get that. But that's where doing your practice interviews and practicing even in the virtual format can be helpful. Along those lines, I would also encourage you to think about what are other ways that you can learn about programs other than just reading through their program websites. I think we've come a long way in the last several years in terms of really giving a flavor of a program through a website. But one of the most informative things that I did was when I was getting ready to apply to graduate school, I was doing a summer internship in the Washington, D.C. area. And at the time, there were 3 genetic counseling training programs in the area. And I took the opportunity to go and meet with the program directors of those programs before I was applying, because once you start applying, then it gets weird in terms of, are you crossing boundaries with having these additional conversations? But it was through beginning to talk to people at programs that I could really begin to understand what were some of the things that differentiated one program from another. And one of the ways that I think you may have the opportunity to do that now, and I would encourage you to look for these opportunities, is many genetic counseling training programs offer some sort of virtual open house or information session, things like that. Even if it's for a program, right? Even if you know you want to go to school in a certain geographical area, for instance, do what they tell you to do when you're applying to undergrad, which is throw in a couple of schools that don't really quite fit 100% with your criteria, because A, you may be pleasantly surprised, or B, it may help you begin to articulate what are you looking for in a graduate school and in that training program. Because if you apply and if you are offered interviews, the last step as an applicant is to rank the programs. And so for me, I needed more pieces of information to know what I was even comparing against. So Alicia gave the example earlier of how is the program structured? Is it all courses and then clinicals, or are they together? And so take advantage of some of those opportunities to learn about those programs in other ways other than just looking at their website, because to me, they all essentially read the same, because they're all ultimately preparing you for that final step, which is your national certification exam.
That's a fantastic point, Alyson. And I think something else that I did not appreciate, one, because it didn't exist when I was younger, but Instagram. So most of the genetic counseling programs now also have an Instagram account. And that Instagram account is a lot of times run by the genetic counseling students. And so it's a great opportunity to interact with them in some cases, but to see what the students are doing on a day-to-day basis. They take a lot of pictures. Some of them have Twitter accounts as well that you can engage with. So there's always some social media opportunities too, that you can get a feel for what that program looks like. And Alyson alluded to the match. That was something we hadn't talked about yet. But that's something that is important, that if you're interested in genetic counseling, I would encourage anyone to go ahead and look into what that match process looks like, because it can be confusing and difficult to understand how it works, because each of the programs that you interview will rank everyone that they interviewed, but then you as an applicant also have to rank everywhere that you interviewed. And it's a computer that decides through some algorithm that no one's explained to me, but it works. And you find out one day as a program, these are the 8 students that you're going to have. And as a student, you find out what program you're going to go to. So it's very important that you only put in that match programs that you would seriously go to, because once you've matched, there is no turning back.
I'm really glad you said that. Just to kind of clarify that process, that was something I wasn't as familiar with either. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We were talking a lot about self-care and all those things. Everybody has time and things they need to go do, and we're right at 8 o'clock. So I just want to thank all the panelists really for taking the time after a busy work day to share some of your insight and knowledge with our students. Students who are here tonight, I'll make sure to send out both the recording of the panel and also the contact information for panelists if you'd like to follow up and ask a more specific question or learn a little bit more about their experience. Also, shameless plug for the Malone Center for Career Engagement, because as you all were talking about practicing interviewing, we do have a virtual practice interview platform that's free for all Furman students, and you can utilize that through our office as well. So if you're interested in practicing more interviewing or preparing for things like that, we're happy to help. Dr. Liao, do you have anything to add?
Well, for all of students, if you're interested in being on the mailing list, I do have a mailing list of students who are interested in genetic counseling. So you can email me and I can put you on the list. All these people actually gave me a lot of information and more about LUM. If I can invite everybody back, it'll be a big party of genetic counselors. It's just so good. Just email me and I'll try to find someone to help you. I don't know how many people I sent it to Alyson and so thank you so much. We're so proud of you. I wish you can come back one day for homecoming or something so we can really have a big party together.
Awesome. Well, thanks
All
everybody.
right, thank you.